Right, okay, let's try again. I suspect I've now lost you all, but that's fine. So, welcome to Lockdown Learning Bioinformatics-along. And what I'm going to try and do over the next few weeks, if I don't keep accidentally making things crash, in a marvellous display of technical competence right at the beginning of this, just to inspire confidence, is try to teach some of you who are stuck at home during this lockdown some bioinformatics. Hopefully, for some of you at least, this is something that you want to do and that you want to use this period productively. And it's possible that you've been aware that bioinformatics is something that would be really helpful, but you haven't really known how to begin learning. So what you've got now is a period where you're in the house, you can't go out, you've got an ideal time where you can learn your bioinformatics, and hopefully I can show you some of the basics. So what we're going to do is start at the very beginning with some command line Linux, and along the way we're going to learn some skills and try to use those skills to analyze some real data. And I'm going to try and find a data set that's relevant to our current epidemic, so something to do with coronaviruses or similar to that. Okay, so to begin, the first thing that we need to do to begin with is to download some stuff. And certainly one of these things is really quite big, so I want to get the download started right at the beginning so that we have some time once that download is successfully completed to get going. So what we're going to do is set up an environment in which we can do all of our bioinformatics over the next few weeks. And so that everybody has the same environment, and this is important because I can't be in control of the computer that's on your desk or the resources that are available to you at the place where you work. So I can't tell you all to log into your local Linux server and do everything there. So what we're going to do is we're going to install a Linux virtual machine on the machine that you've got in front of you, and we're going to use that for all of the work. So we need to download two things to make that happen. The first thing is a virtual machine manager. So that's a piece of software that's capable of running the virtual machine. And the one that we're going to use for this work is called VirtualBox. So VirtualBox is made by a company called Oracle, and they distribute it for free. So it's freely available, virtual machine manager, which is good for our purposes this over the next few weeks. So we're going to download VirtualBox. So you need to go to the VirtualBox website. It's virtualbox.org if you're following along with me today. And when you visit virtualbox.org, you should see a page like this with a massive download VirtualBox button right in the middle of the screen. So if you click that button, that will take you through to a site where you can pick the appropriate VirtualBox package for your machine that's in front of you. So for most people at home, that will almost certainly be a Windows machine or a Mac. And so if you've got a Windows machine, then download the version of VirtualBox for Windows hosts. If you have a Mac, then download the version of VirtualBox for OS X. So I have a Mac, so I'm running Mac OS, so I'm going to download that OS X hosts version. And actually, I've already downloaded it, so I'm not going to download it now because I want my bandwidth to be reserved for this live stream. Okay, so you're going to download that. And then the other thing that you need to download is a guest operating system. So that's the operating system that we're going to run in the in VirtualBox. So that's our virtual machine. And what we're going to run in our virtual machine is an operating system called Xubuntu, Xubuntu. So Xubuntu is a nice Linux-based operating system that's lighter weight than the full Ubuntu operating system, which you may have heard of. So we're going to use Xubuntu because it's a slightly smaller download. So if you go to the Xubuntu homepage, which is xubuntu.org, you can see in my address bar there at the top, xubuntu.org. So if you go there, then again there's a download button on the homepage. So you click on the download button. That takes you through to another site. We're going to download for a 64-bit system. We're going to download the ISO directly. So we're not going to download a torrent because I don't want to have to try and figure out how to use torrents today as well as everything else. So instead we're going to do a direct download from a mirror. So you've got a list of mirror sites here. So pick the mirror that's geographically closest to you. So I'm going to pick one of the UK mirrors. You've got University of Kent or you've got Canonical. So pick one of those. And then we're going to download the 64-bit PC desktop image, which is linked to at the top there. You've got a full list of lots of files that are available here if you want to scroll down. The one that you want to get directly, if you want to download it from the link down here, is this Xubuntu 1804.4 desktop amd64.iso. That's the file that you want to download. And the reason that we're going to set that off downloading right now is because, as you can see, it's quite a big file. It's about 1.5 gig. So that's going to take, certainly on my home connection, about 10 to 15 minutes to download. So we want to get that downloading now so that we can set stuff up within the time that we have today. And I should say at this point, I'm aiming to talk for around about an hour, but no longer if at all possible. Okay, so kick off that download by clicking on that and accepting the download. And if you've got VirtualBox and Xubuntu downloading, then we'll be good to go. Hopefully in about 10 or 15 minutes. And what I'm going to do is use that time, that 10 or 15 minutes, to introduce myself and kind of what I'm trying to do with these sessions. Okay, so first of all, me. So why should you tune in and listen to me every day when you could probably go and find other tutorials and there's lots of other ways of learning this stuff. So why specifically should you spend any time listening to me, which is actually a fair enough point of view to take. And there are indeed plenty of other tutorials out there, and I would absolutely encourage you, if you are at all interested in seriously learning bioinformatics, to go and find that kind of material and make use of it, because it will supplement what I'm trying to do here. I hope that what we will do over the next few weeks in these sessions will be useful. And the reason that I hope it will be useful is I do have quite a lot of experience in training people in bioinformatics. Okay, so I took a master's degree in bioinformatics around about 15 years ago now, quite scarily. I graduated with that degree in 2005. And I took that qualification after I had done my PhD in genetics. So I did a PhD in genetics at the University of Leicester, graduated in 2004 with that. And I wasn't the biggest fan of lab work in the world, so wanted to pursue my scientific interests and continue in science, but without without necessarily having to do lots of lab work. Wasn't a huge fan of getting my hands dirty in the lab, and to be brutally honest, I wasn't fantastically good at it. So what I had enjoyed doing during that time was the computer work that I had done. So I had spent a reasonable amount of time analysing small amounts of data during my PhD, and I wanted to take that further. I wanted to pursue that more. So I went off to the University of Leeds to do a master's degree in bioinformatics, which I really enjoyed, and I wanted to continue to work in bioinformatics. And so I was lucky enough to secure a job at the University of Newcastle, working in a brandly new set up core facility there, the Bioinformatics Support Unit. Fast forward 15 years, and I'm still working in the Bioinformatics Support Unit. In fact, I'm running the Bioinformatics Support Unit and have been for the last about 8.5 years now. And as part of that work, I have analysed hundreds and hundreds of data sets in lots and lots of different areas of the life sciences. I've done lots of really unusual things. I've seen the rapid development of high throughput sequencing and had to adapt my own skills to be able to look after that kind of data. And also, we have established a long-running and very successful program of training researchers, and that's kind of where I wanted to get to with this introduction, which is that we've done my unit, led by me, but also involving other members of the unit. We've done a lot of training of researchers in bioinformatics over the last 3 or 4 years. We run dedicated 3 to 4 day workshops introducing people to basic bioinformatics skills, right through to analysing transcriptomics data, which is kind of the aim of what I want to do here. The frustration that I find personally with that kind of training is that a 3-day workshop, however much you can get done, is very rarely enough time to really kind of introduce people to all of the things that you feel that they should know about the kind of nitty-gritty of the way that bioinformatics works. And so along comes lockdown learning, and allowed me to take a little bit of a different approach. And the fact is that we've got this weird, unplanned, but looking like it's going to be very lengthy period of working from home. And for me as a bioinformatician, that doesn't actually make a great deal of difference to my day-to-day work. I'm able to do exactly the same things from home as I can do from my desk. But I know that scientists who are used to spending lots of time in the lab and working in the lab, this period is a period of very large disruption for them, and a period where they're not necessarily going to be able to pursue the work that they would usually pursue. So there's lots and lots of people, probably thousands of lab-based scientists around the world, who are looking for something to do in this period that's productive, and that hopefully will give them some new skills for when they get to return to the lab. And one of the really obvious things that people would want to learn is bioinformatics, because people increasingly are generating these huge data sets way beyond anything that we could have produced 10 years ago in pursuit of their research. And I'm very aware, because we analyse a lot of it, that there's a distinct kind of gap between the ability to generate that data and the ability to analyse it. And so it will be a really productive use of researchers' time over these months of lockdown to learn some practical hands-on bioinformatics skills. So putting two and two together, I have the experience of teaching people these skills, and we all have the time to sit here at our desks in our respective houses and hopefully all learn something together. So, with all of that in mind, on to kind of the point of what we're trying to do here, and that is to start from scratch. So I'm assuming nothing on the part of anybody. So what I hope is that if you've never done any bioinformatics before, if you've never looked at the Linux command line sideways, then you will be able to get something from these sessions, that this is not going to go maybe straight over your head, and I'm going to be assuming far too much prior knowledge. But by the same token, if you have done a little bit before, we should hopefully relatively quickly get to a point where these sessions are interesting to you and providing you with information and things that maybe you haven't done before. So as I've already explained today, we're going to install an operating system, a virtual machine operating system, which allows us to all have the same environment. And then as we work through the days, I'm aiming to do this daily if at all possible, as we work through those days, we will slowly build up the knowledge that we need so that in a few weeks' time we can be sat analysing a transcriptomics data set on our machines, and everybody will be on the same page. Everybody hopefully will have come along with me together, and I really hope that people manage to keep up and that people stick with it. It is going to go slowly. I'm going to say that right out of the gate, is I'm not going to rush, and that's entirely intentional. Okay, everything suggests that we're going to be working from home for a number of months, and so if we've got 12 weeks of this and I do an hour a day 5 days a week, that's 60 hours. Now 60 hours, if you did 60 hours in an intensive course, you're talking about sort of 2 weeks of training. That's an awful lot. That's a lot more than we currently provide on our short courses. So I can afford to go much more slowly than I would do in those short courses, and that's entirely my intention. So there's going to be lots of asides. There's going to be lots of kind of taking it gradually and building up the knowledge over this daily sessions to hopefully the point where we've built up a really useful pool of knowledge, and we can do some really exciting things with that knowledge. Okay, so with all of that in mind, hopefully I've waffled on long enough that your VirtualBox and your operating system have finished downloading. If that's not the case, don't worry too much, because for one thing, we're going to install VirtualBox first and do some tinkering around that before we get to the OS, and the OS is the thing that will take the time to download. And also, as with all of these videos, my plan is to, I'm recording as I go, so I'm not just streaming, I'm also recording locally. So when I'm done, I'm going to upload that recorded version, which should be higher quality than the streamed version as well, to YouTube. And so if you don't manage to follow along live, you can review what we've done later. Okay. First of all, VirtualBox. So I've downloaded the VirtualBox package for macOS. So I'm just going to open that here. I've already installed VirtualBox, so I don't necessarily need to install it again. I'm just going to show you what this looks like. So also, I'm running macOS, so I can't show you what this looks like for Windows, but I would imagine that you've downloaded some sort of installer which will present you with something that you can double click and VirtualBox will install, which is exactly what I have here for OS X, right? So I've got a VirtualBox package which I can double click, and that package, I'm just going to make sure I drag everything into my live screen here. That package will get installed in the usual way that all packages on macOS get installed. So you can walk yourself through that installation process, and it's not any different to installing any other piece of software on macOS. Okay, so as I said, I've already installed VirtualBox, so at this point I'm going to quit the installer. I'm not going to carry on with that installation, but you should be able to install that, and it shouldn't take, hopefully, very long. So if you walk through your installer, obviously I'm already running VirtualBox, so it's going to refuse to install it for me anyway. I'm going to quit the installer, and I'm going to carry on talking while you install VirtualBox, and I'm going to show you the next step. So I'm going to get rid of that from there. Okay, so that's VirtualBox. Once it's installed, then you need to run it. So we're going to have, if I get a new, so here's my applications directory on OS X, and I've got VirtualBox there. So I will run it by double clicking that icon there, and that will get me VirtualBox up and running. Again, I'm kind of sat here with it running, so it's not won't be massively a surprise to you that I've already got it sat here. I'm going to just drag it onto screen, and there you go. So that's VirtualBox. So when you run it for the first time, it should look something like this. So hopefully, if you've got VirtualBox installed and you've run it, you should get a window that looks like this. Now, obviously, on Windows it may look slightly different, but the idea is basically the same. Okay. Now, also hopefully, you've got your Xubuntu .iso file downloaded. Now, again, I'm at this point going to kind of continue the instruction and assume that there's a few people who are following along who have managed to download that ISO file. If you haven't, don't worry. Have a look at, have a watch, follow the instructions along, get an idea of what to do, and then you can come back to this video later, and once you've got the ISO file downloaded, follow the instructions along to get to the point that everybody else is at by the time we pick up tomorrow. Okay, so I had already downloaded my ISO file, so away we go. So I'm going to click in my VirtualBox window. I'm going to create a new virtual machine. So I'm going to click the button labeled New in the toolbar. You could go to Machine, New, or you can just click New. Okay, so this brings up a dialog, which is there to begin the process of creating a virtual machine. Okay, so this is where we're going to describe our new virtual machine. So I'm going to call it lockdown-learning, no spaces in the name. It's going to be a Linux machine. So that's Xubuntu is a flavor called a flavor of Linux. So it's a Linux operating system. So that's the type of machine that we're going to set up. And Xubuntu is a flavor of Ubuntu. So I'm going to tell VirtualBox that I'm installing an Ubuntu virtual machine, which to all intents and purposes I am. Okay, so that's the settings of that initial screen to create our new virtual machine. So we've got a name, we've got a place where we're going to store it, and the default for that is usually absolutely fine. We're installing a Linux machine, and it's a flavor of Ubuntu. So that's great. So that's that all set up, ready to go. So we're going to click continue. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do is allocate an amount of the memory in our machine to our virtual machine. And when our virtual machine is running, it's going to consume that memory from the host. That is, in my case, my MacBook Pro sat on my desk in my home office. So my MacBook Pro has 16 gigs of RAM. My VM certainly doesn't need all of that, but it needs enough to run the applications that we're going to run and not completely grind to a halt. So by default, VirtualBox will allocate a gigabyte of RAM to your virtual machine. I think it's probably sensible to give it a little bit more. This will depend on the resources of your system at home. So it might be that you haven't got a huge amount to give it, so therefore give it 2 gig. So slide this up to 2048. You know, if you've got a 4 gig machine, give it 2 gig. In my case, I've got 16 gig. I want to give it a little bit more, so I'm going to slide this up to 4 gig, or 4096 megabytes, which is 4 gig. So I'm going to slide this up so that I give my virtual machine 4 gigabytes of RAM. That will mostly be enough for it to do the things that we want it to do without grinding to a halt, but not so much that it completely overtakes my host operating system. Okay, so I'm going to give my VM 4 gigabytes of RAM, and hopefully you've got enough resources to do something fairly similar on your machine. So off we go. Okay, so the other thing that our virtual machine needs, other than RAM, is a hard disk. And again, in order to create this hard disk, you're going to create a virtual hard disk on your machine's actual hard disk. So we're going to create a virtual hard disk which belongs to our virtual machine. We're only going to store the operating system on our virtual hard disk. All of the other files, all of the data that we download, all of the files that we create as we do our bioinformatics over the next few weeks, we're going to create outside of the operating system. I'm going to show you how to do that before the end of this session. So this hard drive only needs to store the OS, the operating system. So a very small hard drive will do. So in this case, it's going to be a 10 gigabyte hard drive, which is big enough to store the operating system and a few extra bits and pieces, but not so much that we're going to give over loads of our hard drive to this machine. So we're going to create that. It's going to be a VirtualBox disk image because we don't need it to be portable. We're always going to work in VirtualBox. So the VDI, the VirtualBox disk image, is the best thing to use in this case. And we're going to dynamically allocate it. So rather than just creating a 10 gigabyte file straight off, which is going to be our hard drive, instead we're going to create a file which can get bigger as the things stored on that hard drive get bigger. So we're going to make a dynamically allocated drive. This is sensible to do. It means that the performance of our machine will be slightly reduced, be slightly lower than it would otherwise be. But that's okay, because most of the files that we're going to create are not going to be on this virtual hard drive. It's not going to slow things down too much, and it's going to save us kind of giving over loads of our hard drive to this machine from the get-go. So just to confirm here, the things that we've just set up in the last couple of windows. So this is our virtual disk image where it's going to be stored on our host operating system's hard drive. We're going to create a 10 gig image, a 10 gig drive. We can slide this around and change the size if we want to, or we can type in the size in this box. So 10 dot, not 1000, sorry, 10 dot, oh, 10, that'll do. Okay, so that's our 10 gig file. So we're going to create that. And that's made the kind of holding point for our virtual machine. So we've created all of the information that this machine needs. And now in our main VirtualBox window, we can see our new virtual machine. It tells us that it's powered off and it's all set up here. But at the moment, this virtual machine is just an empty 10 gigabyte hard drive. It has with 4 gigs of RAM. It has nothing else associated with it. It has no operating system installed, nothing. So in order to get the operating system installed, we need to tell our virtual machine where to find that operating system, and the operating system is in the ISO file that you downloaded from Xubuntu.org. So if you just downloaded that file, it will almost certainly be in your downloads folder. It is an ISO file, is effectively a virtual CD. It's a virtual disk. And here in our virtual machine, under storage, we have a virtual optical drive. So this is effectively a CD drive, and we have a virtual CD that we're going to put into that drive. Okay, so we're going to click on where it says empty, and we're going to click choose a disk file. So I've already got it here because I've tested installing Xubuntu to make sure that it works, but I'm going to walk through and I'm going to choose a disk file. Okay, so we're going to look for that ISO file that we just downloaded from Xubuntu. Choose a disk file. That pops up a dialog, in this case with my downloads folder, because I've done this before. So it's showing me my downloads folder because I've already installed operating systems from there before. So you can see the Xubuntu ISO file is there in my downloads folder. Okay, so on your system, you'll want to navigate to the same place, your downloads folder, and hopefully find the Xubuntu disk image that you've just downloaded, this ISO file that you've just downloaded. So point to that file and click open. And that is like putting a CD with the Xubuntu operating system on it, burned onto it, into your disk drive. So into our virtual disk drive, we've put our virtual CD. Okay, and now when we start this virtual machine, when we click the start button above, it's going to boot. So our virtual machine is going to boot. And when it boots, it looks in 3 places for an operating system. And that's listed in the system section here. It's listed in boot order. So it's going to look for a floppy disk, because we're nothing if not arcane and looking back in history in computing. So it's going to look for a floppy disk somewhere. It's not going to find one. And then after that, it's going to look for an optical disk. And it's going to find this Xubuntu ISO in our optical drive. And it's going to boot the operating system from there. And then if it didn't find that, it would look on the hard disk. And at the moment, there's nothing on the hard disk. So we're going to boot. And it's going to find our Xubuntu disk in our optical drive. And it's going to boot from that medium. So I'm going to press start. And my virtual machine is going to open. Here it is, booting up. And it's going to find in my drive, it's going to find the Xubuntu disk, and it's going to boot from that disk, which is what's currently happening. Is it's running that disk and it's starting to boot. So here we go. You can see Xubuntu starting up, and it's going to give us 2 options. We can try Xubuntu, in which case it's going to run it from that optical drive, which is not what we want to do. The other thing that we can do is we can install Xubuntu onto our hard drive, and that's what we want to do. So we want to install Xubuntu. So pick your language on the left-hand side. Obviously, I'm going to stick with English because otherwise I would get very stuck very quickly. And I'm going to install Xubuntu. So I'm going to click that button, and this will start the process of the installation. So installation here is going to take 5 or 10 minutes. It's not instantaneous, but it shouldn't take very long. Okay, so again, there's a few settings to sort out before we get there. So you can see we've got a few windows to go through down at the bottom here. The first of those is to pick your keyboard layout. So my keyboard is a UK layout. If on the other hand you've got a US keyboard, that's fine. Just pick the layout that matches the keyboard that's sat on your desk. Okay, so I'm picking the UK keyboard layout, and I've got a standard UK keyboard, so off we go. The next thing. Okay, download updates while installing Xubuntu. We want to keep our OS up to date. We want all of our security updates, so I'm going to keep that button checked. But I don't want to do anything else, so I'm not going to tick this install third-party software button, because the graphics and things don't really matter for what we're going to do, so we don't need cutting-edge drivers, but we do want all of our security updates. So we're going to download updates while we're installing the operating system. Click continue, and then again the default here is absolutely fine. We're going to erase the disk. It's empty anyway, it's a new empty disk, so that's fine. So we're going to erase the disk and we're going to install Xubuntu on that disk, and then we click install now. Yes, we're sure. We're going to continue, and then it's going to give us a couple more options. The first one is time zone. Where are you? I'm not in London, but I'm close enough. It's the right time zone. I'm in GMT. And then we're going to set up our user account. So the user account that we set up here is the user account that we're going to use for all of our training. So at this point, what you do will diverge slightly from what I do. So I'm going to type in my name, and then I'm going to set the name of my computer, and I'm going to call it Lockdown Learning. like I did before. I'm going to pick a username, and actually Simon is fine for me. That's an okay username. And then I'm going to pick a password. Because this is a virtual machine and it's only going to be running when we choose for it to be running, you don't need to worry massively about your password being incredibly secure. So I've picked a password that I can definitely remember, and that's going to be very important that you can remember that password, and it's something that you're not going to just forget. I'm also going to set this machine to log in automatically, because I know from testing all of this stuff out that having to log in repeatedly can get to be a bit of a pain. So I'm going to log in automatically. And then I'm going to hit continue. So this will take a couple of minutes. So it's going to copy all of the files from that virtual CD that we put into our optical drive onto our little virtual hard drive that created this lockdownlearning.vdi file, which is our virtual hard drive. So it's going to copy all of the files of our OS into there. Then it's going to download some updates and install those updates, and then we'll be done. And it should only take a couple of minutes. The reason that I'm using this particular operating system is because it's the operating system I have the most experience with. So I've been working with Ubuntu operating systems pretty much since I started in bioinformatics. It's been around for a long time. I think the first release of Ubuntu was in 2004. The one that we're working with here, which is called 1804, was, as the name suggests, released in April of 2018. So it's getting on for 2 years old. But the reason that we're using this particular release of Ubuntu, in this case Xubuntu, which is just a lighter weight version of Ubuntu really, is because it's what's called the long-term support, or LTS release. So every 2 years, the good folks at Canonical, who produce the Ubuntu operating system, they release what's called a long-term support release. That version of their operating system is supported with security updates for 5 years. So it makes really good sense to work with the long-term support releases of Ubuntu when you're working in Linux. And so we're using 1804. The next long-term support release will be in April 2020, so in next month. Although, obviously, in the current situation, who knows if that's actually going to be the case, or whether we're going to be stuck with 1804 for a while yet. But never mind, it gets security updates until 2023, so we don't need to worry about that too much. So our OS is pretty much installed. It's just finishing up the last few things here, making sure that it's done everything that it needs to do to run, and then it's going to be done setting up, and it's going to ask us to restart. So we're a few seconds away now from it asking us to restart, and I'll hit restart, and then we'll do a little bit of setup before the end of our session. So we're about 45 minutes in, so we've got a quarter of an hour or so, certainly a kind of the amount of time that I want to spend talking continuously, which I'm not terribly good at. So we've got about 15 minutes left to do a little bit of setup to get us to a point tomorrow where we can start doing some slightly more interesting things, rather than watching installers and watching download progress bars and things like that, which I realise is not the most fascinating way to spend an hour necessarily. Okay, so there you go. My installation is done, so I'm going to hit restart. Okay, so my virtual machine is going to reboot. So you'll see it shut down, and then it says, please remove installation medium, and press enter. Well, if we look behind our running virtual machine here, you can see that VirtualBox has removed the installation medium for us because our optical drive is now empty. So we can press enter. So we'll hit enter, and our VM will now reboot. And what I'm going to do when it's rebooted, so it's rebooting here now. I'm going to come back up, and it shouldn't take very long. It should boot relatively quickly. When it's come back up, there we go. I'm just going to change some settings, first of all, to make it a little bit bigger because it's quite small. So I want it to occupy a little bit more of my video space. So I'm going to go to settings over here on the, so I've clicked the little mouse here in the top left hand corner. That's like my start menu in Xubuntu. So like start, or like the Apple menu on Mac OS. This is like my little kind of master place to go. So I'm going to click the little mouse, and that brings up lots of programs. So you can see lots of pieces of software that have been installed here. And over on the right hand side of that little pane, my settings. So I'm going to click on settings, and then I'm going to click on display because I want to make the display larger. So here we go. This is our display. It's a virtual display, unsurprisingly, because this is a virtual machine. We want to make it bigger. So at the moment it's 800 by 600, which is really quite small. I want it to take up more of my screen. So I'm going to make it so that it fits so you can see the whole thing. I'm going to make mine 1920 by 1200. And I'm going to apply that setting. And there you go. It's made my VM a bit bigger. Now it occupies a bit more of my screen. And you can see hopefully a bit more of what I'm doing. Okay, so that's resized my display. And now the next thing that I want to do is I want to install something called the guest additions. The reason I want to do this, just to be very clear, is that I want my virtual machine to be able to share files with my host machine, so with my laptop. It can't do that by default. It's running in a little box and it can't see the files of my host operating system, which is a nice secure way of it running. But I want to be able to share files between the two, so that if I want to download something like from a standard web browser, I can download it into that place and I can see those files from within my virtual machine and vice versa. So I want to share some files between my two operating systems. So to do that, I need these things called the guest additions. So in order to install those, you go to the devices menu, and the guest addition CD image should be down at the bottom of that menu that pops up. So we want to insert the guest addition CD image, and that will put and again a virtual CD into that virtual optical drive. And so that will, it's like putting a CD into a drive, and it will appear here on my desktop. So I can see that CD has been inserted into that drive, and it pops up the files that are on that drive here on my desktop in a little file manager window. So I want to run this CD, and in order to do that I need to run this file called auto run, and I've got to do that, I'm afraid, from a terminal. So this is the first point at which we're going to open a terminal. We're going to spend an awful lot of time in the next few weeks inside a terminal, so it's probably a good idea to get used to it. So if you right click your mouse in this file manager window, one of the options is open terminal here, and that's what we want to do. That will open a terminal that's running inside that inside that directory, inside that folder. So I'm going to maximize this terminal. I'm going to make the text a bit bigger. Control plus doesn't work, so I'm going to go view, zoom in, view, zoom in, view, zoom in, and maybe once more, zoom in. Okay, so just to make the text a bit bigger. So I'm now running this terminal inside that CD image, and what you need to do is type, and at this point you just want to copy along with me. I will explain how this works in future lessons. // and then auto run.sh, okay, and that will run that CD. It requires your password because it needs to run as an admin user. So you need to enter your password. I've just mistyped it. There we go. To run, and that will run that CD, and that will install those things called the guest additions. And that is useful to us. That's useful to us for what we want to do both today, or mainly in future lessons. So this will just take a couple of minutes, and then once it's finished, it says press return to close this window. So we enter, and that closes that window. And now those guest additions are installed, and at this point, we need to give our machine a reboot. And I'm afraid there's going to be a couple of reboots before we're finished yet today. So if you go back to the little mouse menu, there's a power icon in the bottom right. Click that and click restart to restart your VM. And amazingly, I can see that some of you are still watching, which is great. I'm really pleased that some people have got this far through and are still following along. So I hope that this has been interesting so far. I promise you that these lessons will get more involved and more advanced as we carry on. It's not all going to be this kind of fairly painful installation process. Okay, so my VM has rebooted, and what I need to do now is set up a directory that is shared between my virtual machine and my host machine, and this is the final thing that we're going to do today. So back to that devices menu up in the top, and under devices you want to go to shared folders and then shared folders settings. Okay, so at the moment we have no folders that are shared between our virtual machine and our host machine. So we want to add a new folder. So the path is where that folder is on our host machine. So this is on my laptop. So I'm going to click Other, and this brings up a dialog. This is my laptop my laptop file system here, and in my home directory on my laptop, I've got a directory here called VM files. So you can create a new directory. So we could do this. Let me just cancel that for a second. Bring in a Finder window here. So here's Finder. I'm in my home directory here, which is named after my username. I'm going to right click and say, no, sorry, I'm going to right click in here. Actually, I'm going to press Command Shift N to make a new directory. So there you go, I've made a new folder. I'm going to call it something, so I'm going to call it Lockdown Learning. Okay, so that's created that new directory there. And then I'm going to add that as a shared directory. Okay, so drag that back out of the way, go back to my VM here. So Other, there we are, Lockdown Learning, pick that, open. Okay, so that's my folder name. That's the thing that I want to share. I want to mount it on my host operating system. So again, you're going to have to follow along with me here. So here you want to type /home/ whatever username it was that you picked when you installed your virtual machine. So I picked Simon. You might have picked something different. And then I'm going to create a directory called share with a capital S. Okay, so that's where I'm going to put these files. I want to make it permanent. So I'm going to tick that button, and I want it to mount when I boot my machine. So I want to auto mount. So I'm going to tick that button as well. And then I'm going to click OK. And that will create that directory for me on my virtual machine. Okay. So I'm going to click OK. That's done. And now if I open my home directory, you'll see all of these folders that you get because you've got your desktop and your documents folder and your downloads folder, just like in any other operating system. But I also have this directory called share, okay, which at the moment has a big cross on it, and that's because at the moment I don't have the permission to write files in that directory. And I'm afraid again we're going to need a little bit of arcane terminal magic to make that directory writable. So I'm just going to drag this over to the right hand side, and I'm going to open a new terminal. So under my little mouse menu, I'm going to go to Terminal Emulator, open that, And again, I'm going to make the text a bit bigger, so hopefully you can see what I'm doing. 2, 3, and one more. Oh. And then I'm going to type a slightly arcane command, and I'll try and explain what this command does. So the first thing is I'm going to type sudo. So sudo means whatever command I now type, I want you to run as administrator. Okay, so that's the first thing. And then my actual command is usermod. That modifies my user. I want to add a group to my user, so that's -G, and then VBox SF, which stands for, VBox SF, which stands for VirtualBox Shared Files. And I realize this is very arcane. I want to add this group to the user called Simon, which is my username. If your username is different, which I presume it is, then use your username there. If you're unsure of what your username was, it's at the beginning of the line here. So you can see I'm Simon at Lockdown Learning. Okay, so sudo usermod -G VBox SF -A Simon, which looks very arcane, but essentially what this does is it adds you to this group called VBox SF, or VirtualBox Shared Files. You'll want your password, so type in your password. Make sure you type it correctly, which I did, good. So that's added me to that group. That doesn't take effect until I reboot this machine, okay? So if I type groups, it tells me which groups I'm a part of, and at the moment I'm a part of these groups, so Simon, ADM, you don't need to worry about the details of this, but on that list is not VBox SF, and it won't be there until this machine is rebooted. So again, this is the last time for today. We're going to reboot our virtual machine. Okay, so click on the mouse, click on the power button, click on restart. And that's going to reboot our virtual machine. This is the last time today. Once this is rebooted, we will now have access to that shared files directory. So I'm just going to drag in my Finder window over here on the right. So this here, oh no. Okay, so teething problems. VirtualBox has quit, so I'm going to reopen it. Apologies for that. Here's VirtualBox. Okay, let's start our virtual machine again. Here we go. So it's running again. Here comes our virtual machine booting up. Hopefully going to be fine. Okay, so this is the directory that I've shared on my local machine. So this is Finder on macOS. And here is my Xubuntu virtual machine running in this window here. I'm going to double click on this home directory. And you can see hopefully now the share directory no longer has that cross in the corner. So again, I'm going to double click the share, and now you can see that we have an empty folder here. We've got an empty folder here. If I create a file in here, I'm going to create a document with just an empty file, and I'm going to call it file, all in capitals. I'm going to create it. It appears there in my virtual machine. It's also appeared here on Finder, exactly the same file. So I created it in my virtual machine, and you can see it there. It's also available here in Finder, and I can delete it in Finder. So if I move it to the bin in Finder, away it goes, and it disappears from my Mac. And then if we go back to our virtual machine and refresh, it's also disappeared from our virtual machine. Okay, so now we have this directory, this share directory, and anything that we do to the files in that directory, we can see reflected both on our virtual machine and on our host operating system. And that is the point I wanted to get to today. And I know that that's a lot of faff and a lot of kind of fiddling around with probably new technologies to a lot of you, but hopefully some of you have got to this point. And if not, I will upload this video after we finished here, and you can catch up with anything that you missed and hopefully get to this point before we pick up again tomorrow. And tomorrow we will start our lessons in Linux. So we will start learning to use that terminal where we've had to type a couple of commands already. And those commands have probably been quite opaque to you and not really made very much sense. Well, tomorrow we're going to start learning properly how to use the terminal and how, hopefully, to make some of those commands make some sense. So thank you very much to those of you who have tuned in and who have stuck around. I did have a look. I've not been able to really keep track of the chat or anything like that, but I have occasionally looked at my kind of live stream stats and seen that there are a bunch of people watching, and I'm really, really pleased that there are a bunch of people who've got to the end, and hopefully some of this is going to be at least give you some impetus to come back tomorrow. I really hope that I see some of you again tomorrow and that we can continue our bioinformatics learning together over the next few weeks. So stay safe and stay well, and I will see you tomorrow afternoon at 4 p.m. GMT. Bye, everybody.